In this video, I'm going to talk to you about printing photos. So you should have read chapter 9, which went all over printing photos, but let's just talk about some of the main points. So there is a huge variety of photo papers and materials available to print on. Photo papers are described by how shiny they are or aren't. So shiny would be like high gloss, not so shiny would be matte. What the paper feels like, if it's smooth or textured, and the tone, whether it's cool tone, which has more of a bluish, slight bluish color to it, or warm tone, which it looks a little more yellowish. So luster paper has a slight texture and is great for portraits. Remember this because this might be on the test. Luster paper has a slight texture and is great for portraits. Glossy paper is great for objects and advertisements. Think of magazines. They're almost always on glossy paper. Matte paper has little to no sheen and is preferred by some fine art photographers, especially high-end papers that have textures similar to watercolor paper. Some papers are metallic, which is usually super shiny, light gray, and no texture. Rag, which is very matte, often has a warm tone and feels soft. Even clear transparencies, which can be attached to objects that shine light like a light box or backed with another paper. There's also canvas, which has an extreme texture and usually a matte finish. So I'm going to show you a couple of these papers. So first off, here's an example of gloss versus luster. Versus matte. Now notice how shiny that gloss is. And it's kind of hard to see it in a video. I've tried my best here, but there is definitely a difference between the gloss and the luster. And the luster does have a little bit of a texture. It's not as shiny. The gloss has no texture. It's completely smooth and very shiny. And then this matte paper has no shininess at all, and it is completely smooth. I also want to quickly show you, here's a difference between a premium matte paper, which has a warm tone, has a little bit of a yellowish look, versus this polar matte paper, which has a cool tone, has more of a bluish look. And it's not something that super stands out to you right away, especially when you're first exploring photo papers, but when you put them next to each other, you can definitely tell the difference. Okay, so for a nice looking photo when you're printing, you need to have a resolution of 240 to 300 ppi, which means pixels per inch. So if you want to print a photo and the long side is 10 inches, that means you need to multiply 10 times 300 or 10 times 240. You can have a range between here. And that's how many pixels you should have. So 10 times 240 is 2400. 10 times 300 is 3000. So if you're looking at a photo and you're looking at the pixels and you're thinking, I wonder if I can print this as an 8 by 10. If your longest side has 3000 pixels, you should be good to be able to print at that size. So let's talk about resolution a little bit more. Resolution refers to how many pixels are in your image. So a pixel is a square of solid color, and it is what makes up digital photos. In fact, let me open Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. If I keep zooming and zooming and zooming, we are getting close enough to seeing the individual pixels of this image. So this is what digital images are made up out of. Most digital images. We're going to get into some differences in raster versus vector later on. Don't worry about that for now. Just know that your digital photos are made up of pixels, which are these little squares of color. And so when I say I need 300 pixels per inch, let's see, let's get up here to where my ruler says, okay, so there's the number 2 to the number 3. So that's 1 inch. So in order to have a nice smooth transition when I'm printing, I need to have 240 to 300 little tiny boxes, little pixels of color from here to there in one line. And if I have that, then I have good resolution to print. Okay, so why does this matter? So the more pixels you have, the smoother the transition is going to be between colors. Have you ever had a photo or seen a photo online where it looked something like this, like the sky started looking really funky or something? That is because they have a very low pixel count and there's not enough colors going between these two to create a nice transition. This also happens when you start resaving JPEGs over and over and over again. And keep in mind, if you crop your image, you're also losing pixels. You're cropping pixels out of your images. So that's why if you take a photo with your phone, which is already, well, depending on the phone, maybe a smaller resolution, and then you crop it, it looks worse because you have less pixels working in your favor. Okay, so some general guidelines for resolution. When you're saving stuff to post online for the web, for the internets, you generally want 72 to 96 pixels per inch. Now personally, I go with 100 just to make the math easier in my brain. So if I need something that's going to be seen on desktop computers where they might open it really large, maybe up to 10 inches across their screen, then I want to make sure that the longest side on my image is 10 times 100, which is 1,000 pixels. So the size really does depend on the screen the image is being viewed on. That's why sometimes when we take photos on our phone, it looks really great, they look sharp and everything, but if you open it up on a computer screen, all of a sudden they look really bad. It's because because you're looking at it at a smaller screen, so you don't need as many pixels for things to look better. In fact, if you take one of these really pixelated images and start making it smaller and smaller, it'll eventually start looking good. But if you want it to be larger and not look pixelated, you do need to have, like I said, 72 to 96 pixels per inch. This is important for you guys to know. You might be tested on this. For online, you generally want 72 to 96 pixels per inch. So again, for printing, you generally want 240 to 300 pixels per inch. After 300, there does not seem to be a noticeable difference. So for example, if you're doing a 4x6 inch print, you'd want your image to be 1200 by 1800 pixels. And how I got to this math was 4 inches times 300 pixels is 1200. Okay, and then 6 inches times 300 pixels is 1800. Now, this is really important for you guys to know too. This might be on the test. You might have a question that asks you how many pixels per inch would you need to print, let's say, a 10-inch photo or a 4x6 inch photo. You need to be able to do this math. So just remember, the easiest number to remember is 300 pixels. You have to multiply that by however many inches you want to print, and that's how many pixels you need for that side. And just an FYI, some online printing services recommend as low as 150 ppi. This is usually on textured materials like canvas prints. So it really depends on the printer and their type of printing and how high quality their printing is and what they're printing on. Okay, so we've already talked about saving your PSD file, but just to go over this one more time for you guys, when you go to File, Save in Photoshop, the default extension is PSD. That PSD file will keep all of your layers for the next time you open it in Photoshop. And what we like to call this is a working file. Some people call it a master file. So remember that. Photoshop, the file extension is PSD. It has all of your layers, and a lot of times we call that our working or our master file. Okay, saving a JPEG for online sharing. So now that you guys, last week you should have watched a video on color profiles. So this becomes important when you want to save a JPEG for online sharing. When you want to save a version to post online, so the colors are going to look the same as you're seeing them, you want to convert the color profile to SRGB. sRGB is that smaller color profile that is going to work great across all kinds of devices, and that's why we use sRGB for anything that's going online. It's going to look good whether you're working on a phone or a computer or a tablet. The color scheme should be the same. Your photos should look the same across many different types of devices. But remember, when you do this step, this is one of the last steps I do. This will flatten your layers. So after you're done working on your master file, go ahead and save it, and then you're going to want to start working on this. So you're basically taking your master file, and then you're going to start creating a print file. So you also need to change the, resize the photo sometimes for when you're printing. So go to image, image size to resize. If you're doing this for online, which is what we're talking about, change the resolution to 100 or 72 to 96. And the pixel dimensions to whatever you need. And this is just going to depend. Once you start getting into online graphics, let's say if you're making a Twitter header, they have a very specific pixel size that they recommend that you use. The same with Facebook. The same for every social media, websites. They'll have a very specific pixel count that they usually say works best for where you're trying to put an image. So this is where you would play with the pixel dimensions. So this is the point where I go to File, Save As, and change the file format to JPEG. Do Save As, because if you just hit save at that point, it's going to save over your working file. You're going to lose all those layers. So make sure you're doing Save As. Note that saving as a JPEG compresses the file. The good thing about this is that it means you have a smaller file size if you open it up in file size for uploading online. But if you open it up in Photoshop again, it won't have the layers anymore. Okay. And also know that if you open up a JPEG in Photoshop and then save it as a JPEG again, it will compress that file even more. If you do it again, it compresses it more, it starts to lose quality, and it looks really bad. So that's why it's really good to have that working file, because if you need to change it up and save a new JPEG, you can go to the working file, have all of the quality that you had before, and then just resave that as a JPEG, save as a JPEG instead. So don't save JPEGs as JPEGs, is the moral of that story. Let's see. I suggest renaming for what it's going to be used for. This becomes especially important if you start managing multiple social media sites, especially for business or for your own personal branding. When I make graphics for the people that I help with their social media, that's how it all comes out. I always have it labeled what's for Facebook, what's for Twitter, what's for Instagram, what's for each site, if it's for the website. It makes it easier for yourself, and it makes it easier for someone else later on to figure out what's going on and what to use. Okay, now when you close this final file, this JPEG, Photoshop may ask you if you want to save the PSD after this. And I say don't do it. If you already saved, you already did your initial save when you were done making it as your working file. If you save it now, your working file is going to get saved with the smaller dimensions, the smaller pixels. So as long as you already saved earlier, you should be fine. Just hit do not save. Alright, so when you print a file, you usually want an uncompressed file with all the information still intact. In this case, you'd save a TIFF file. So a TIFF file is going to be just as large usually as PSD files. If you remember from the scanning lecture, I talked about scanning in a TIFF. So that's because it's not compressing the information down. But most people send files to be printed through an online service, and most of those services would rather you have a JPEG file. It really depends on how high quality the printer is. The printers that photographers use, like portrait photographers and stuff, they usually have an option to actually send in your PSD if necessary. So it just kind of depends on the printer and what how much quality you want. If it's Costco, Walmart, you want a JPEG. If it's a higher quality printer, you're going to be okay with sending them in a TIFF or a PSD. Okay, so creating a print file. Now, in normal situations, we would be at school, we would be going over this, and you would actually be printing a photo. Fortunately, that's not now. So, I'm going to go over the basic steps, but I am also going to tell you some really important information you need to know for the test. Okay, so you have your master file. You have saved that. Now you're going to want to go ahead and File Save As to save a copy of your file. And you're going to leave this as a PSD. This is for making a print file that you're printing on your own printer. That's why it's different than the steps I just told you above. That's for sending it into someone. If you're printing on your own, these are the steps you would take because you'd also be printing through Photoshop. You wouldn't have to make a TIFF. You wouldn't have to save a JPEG. You can leave it as Photoshop, and in fact, that's the best way because you have more control over the print settings in Photoshop. Okay, so when you save as, this is when I would add something like 8x10 print. And adding the size is going to be important because you might make multiple files for different sizes with different resolutions. Okay, so next we're going to go to Edit and Convert to Profile. And we're going to choose Adobe RGB 1998. So this is different than earlier. Earlier we were talking about online, that's SRGB. If we are printing, this is good to know for the test, if you're going to be printing your photo and you want to be using Adobe RGB 1998, it has more colors in the color profile than the sRGB. Now also know that doing this step will flatten your layers. That's why we saved this as a new file. Okay, now another good reason for having a separate print file is that if you need to tweak the print a little bit, you can. You can go back to the print file and we'll talk a little bit more in just a moment what I mean by tweaking and what you would have to tweak. So some of the tweaking I'm talking about is sharpening your image for print. You would duplicate your layer and then add a Smart Sharpen through the filter menu. Now, why we are doing this is because we are printing on porous paper. Porous means there's tiny little holes, microscopic holes in there. And the porous paper is going to soak up, even on the smoothest papers, it still has microscopic little holes, but it's going to soak up the ink in a different way. And it's not going to be the same sharpness as we're seeing on our screen. So we want to do an initial sharpness when we're editing so that it looks great on our screen, and that's the master working file. But if we're going to do something, if we're going to go ahead and print it, we want to make sure that we sharpen it so that once that ink gets down on that porous paper, it's just as sharp as what we perceive on the screen. So when you're sharpening for print, you actually might want to over sharpen a little bit according to the screen, because that over sharpening won't be as sharp when you start printing. Okay, so this is important to know. Since we are printing on porous paper, the sharpening we do for images that will be viewed on screen is not quite enough. Important. Okay. So professionals rarely print an image once and are done. They usually do a proof print. This is another important term for you to know. By doing a proof print, this is their print that is not suitable. They're not going to sell to the public. This is their practice run. So they do a proof print, decide if it needs to be sharper or not as sharp, maybe. If they need to change any of the tones, if it's bright enough. And then they make those adjustments on that print file and then do another proof print until they get it right. Another thing you want to do for a print file is adjust the brightness of the image. Now again, we're seeing this on a screen. Our screen is backlit. If you printed the image as it is, it will look darker than what you see on your screen. Paper is not backlit, your screen is. So, in order to create, lighten the file a bit so that it looks better when it's printed, you duplicate your sharpened layer and then change the layer's blend mode to screen. So this lightens everything just a bit. And then you change that opacity to 20%. This just gives it a nice little pop of brightness so that when you print it out on paper, hopefully it's going to look as bright as you saw on the screen. But this is another reason why you would do a proof print to see if it's bright enough or not. So that's something else that's really important for you to know. We have to adjust the brightness of the image for printing because we are used to seeing our images on a screen which is backlit. Okay, so after we've done those steps, you're going to change the resolution and image size. So we've talked about this a little bit already. We go to image, image size, and then enter 300 in the resolution box. So here's the resolution box. Put in 300. And the width and height will change to the size you can print in this resolution. So when you uncheck the resample box, you're telling it to just use the pixels you already have. So here's the resample box. Use the pixels you already have and redistribute them and tell me how many inches I could have redistributed. So if you see right here, we have width 8. There's 2400 pixels. Here's telling me the dimensions, 2400 pixels by 3603. So 8 times 300 is 20. Well, let's just go 8 times 3 is 24. Add the 2 zeros, that's 2400. So I have enough pixels in this image to print an 8 by 12. So at this point, if I was printing this as an 8 by 10, I would go ahead and do my image size like this, leave it at the 8 by 12 by 300, click OK, and then I'd have to go in and crop a couple of inches off the bottom till it was at 10 inches. So here we are. I resized it, 8 by 12 is what we can do. Went up to my crop tool, changed my ratio to 4 to 5, which is the same as 8 to 10. If it's showing, like in this case, if it was horizontal and I wanted it to be vertical, you just have to click on this and it'll move these numbers around, swaps the height and width. And then I would decide where to crop it, and there would be the couple of inches for me to crop off. Okay, then you would save your image by pressing Command S or going to File, Save. So this last bit is what we would be doing if we were printing at school and the computer's there. You would be putting your photo onto the desktop of the printing computer, and we would open it up in Photoshop. You can see we're still using a PSD file. We would go to Print, File, Print, and then we would click our printer. We would then go to the printer drop-down menu and click on Print Settings. And I know this kind of sucks. You can't do this in real life. This is somewhat helpful, hopefully. But just some good stuff to know. So we would go to Printer Settings. So there would be a Print Settings over here. We would hit Printer Settings. And we just want to make sure we have to tell the computer what kind of paper we're using. So we've already told it what kind of printer we're using. And then we're going to tell it to use photo paper, and we would be using ultra premium photo paper luster. There's also a color mode. So that's what that looks like. So we'd come here, go to Printer Settings, Photo Paper, Ultra Premium Photo Paper Luster. And you can't see it too much, but here there's also color mode. You would choose off, no color management. That's because we're going to manage the color through the Photoshop pop-up box instead of this one. For output resolution, we would put 1440 DPI. DPI is similar to PPI. but it's dots per inch. This is referring to dots of ink. So for Superphoto 1440, for every inch, we're putting down 1,440 dots of ink per inch. Okay, click Save. Next, we would go to the color handling. So this is the Photoshop print settings box. And where we were just at was by clicking on this print settings right up here. And now we would go to color handling and choose Photoshop manages color. Then we would choose a printer profile. This is different than a color profile. The printer profile is also called an ICC profile. This tells the printer exactly what paper they're using so that it can put down the ink in the right way. So let's talk about printer profiles. An ICC printer profile, and this is important for you to know for the test. It gives your printer the technical information about the type of paper you were using, such as the thickness and absorbency. There's things inside of a printer that moves every time you use a different ICC printer profile, and it might move up or down depending on the thickness of the paper, and it might put out more or less ink depending on the absorbency of the paper. So you should, if you get into printing on your own, you should use an ICC profile that is made specifically for the paper and printer you are using to get the best results. And in the book, Chapter 9, page 175, there is some more information on printer profiles. So let me show you what I mean. Here's Red River's ICC profile download page. So let's say I just bought a brand new paper from Red River, and I needed to go ahead and get the printer profile for it. So I would come over here, select my printer. Let's say I had an Epson. I'm just gonna pick one. My printer actually just died on me, so I don't have one at the moment. Wah. But then I would go to find your profile, and these are all the different photo papers that they make. So let's say I had just bought Ultra Pro Gloss 2.0. I would go ahead and click on here, and it would have me download a zip archive, and in the zip archive would be an ICC printer profile. Then I would go ahead and install into Photoshop. So I believe if we hit back real quick, we even have a how to install profiles link here. So every person, every big company in the world that creates photo paper has somewhere on their site something like this. And so you would go in and download for every single paper that you have the different ICC profile, so that when you came back here and it was time to pick, you would know which one to pick for here. So on this screenshot you can see we have a bunch of Epson. These were some specialty papers for what we were using for classes and such. There's all kinds of different ICC profiles. Different one for every single paper for every single type of printer out there. I bet you didn't know that printing could get so technical, huh? Okay, so if you want more information, I'll let you guys decide on this. This gets a little bit more technical. Adobe's page on printing with color management. And here is a whole nother video about understanding the color managed workflow. And I believe this one is pretty long, so but it has some really, really great information. So if you are thinking that you might end up going into printing on your own, this is all really good stuff to know. All right, so one more time, ICC printer profile gives you the technical information about the type of paper you are using. Okay, this is very important for you to know. Alright, so once you double check to make sure your settings are right, everything looks right in the previous screen, click print in the bottom right corner. And maybe you're thinking, why the heck do I need to double check? Well, when you start printing with larger printers, they're pretty expensive, And not only are the machines expensive, the ink is extremely expensive. So you don't want to start printing something on the wrong settings and have to quit halfway through and waste all that ink. All right, and then you hit print, and the magic of printing a photo would happen, which I'm really sad we don't get to do this semester. But I hope that you get some really good information on printing here. There are some, make sure that you review everything before the midterm, because there are questions from this lecture in there.